recommendations, as well as they focus only on primary care. I don't do the specialty kind of stuff. So I've been in family medicine, pharmacy for over 50 years. And my job's been my hobby, and that's teaching primary care providers evidence-based drug therapy. So, and I retired 13 years ago, but I'm still failing retirement. I'm still teaching at the college 3 to 4 days a week. I'm still doing a bunch of these kind of things. I'm still consulting in a free clinic, and I'm still having fun. So it's a little more challenging with things. Getting old's not for sissies. I can tell you that, because having recurrent prostate cancer, having Parkinson's disease, diabetes, heart failure, all those things I've had. So it's been a challenge, but almost everything I talk about I've had. So I don't know what else is next, but it beats the alternative. I'd rather be seen than viewed. So. And my wife seems to be okay with that after 53 years. So I don't, let me see if I can get this to go forward. Andy? Push the top one, is not doing anything.
I had it unstuck. I even checked to see if it would stop. I don't know why it's stuck. There you go.
All right. Thank you. I'm glad somebody knows what to do.
Bottom button.
Bottom button.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Great. I don't have anything to disclose. I haven't spoken for industry in over probably a dozen plus years, and I don't serve on any industry advisory boards either. So hopefully nothing that I have to disclose. And we're going to start off with an update on some new information on guidelines for immunizations. And just before we get started, I want to review with you the process where our guidelines come from. First, typically, there has to be an FDA-approved vaccine. So the first step is we get an FDA approval on a vaccine. And the FDA does their evaluation. They make their determination whether they're going to approve it and what it's approved for. And then it goes to the CDC. It's advisory committee. It's called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, ACIP. They review the information, typically make a recommendation to the CDC. So they actually vote whether they should approve it and what the indication should be. Then it's not official until the CDC publishes it in the MMWR, the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. And I would encourage you, you can go online and sign up to get the MMWR for free. So it comes to your inbox whenever they make they publish it. It's published just about every week, hence the weekly report. And once it's published there, it's an official CDC guideline. And that's when you can probably beat up the insurance company and get them to cover that vaccine, because then it's an official recommendation. Prior to that, it's not. And you may or may not be able to get it covered. Whoop, I'm going too far. So the first thing I want to tell you about is an update on Shingrix. This came out last summer, and this is really an important update on the shingles vaccine. People who are immunocompromised are at very high risk for developing shingles. And you all remember the old Zostavax, right? That Merck had, that's off the market now. That was a live attenuated vaccine. And it was contraindicated in people with immunocompromising conditions, even though they're at high risk for getting shingles. The reason it was contraindicated, it was a live vaccine. And the theory was, and there are actually some case reports where people developed disseminated zoster who had received the Zostavax vaccine. So Shingrix is not a live vaccine at all. It's a particle vaccine, so there's no live virus in it at all. So the herpes virus is not in the Shingrix vaccine. So theoretically, we should have been able to use the Shingrix vaccine all along in these people, but there was no evidence, there was no data for it. So the manufacturer did these studies in people immunocompromised. I'll show you some of that data, but this is the FDA approval back on 7/23/21. Approved zoster vaccine, this is Shingrix by GSK, to include prevention of herpes zoster shingles in adults aged 18 and older who are or will be at increased risk of herpes zoster due to immunodeficiency, immunosuppression caused by known disease or therapy. And again, I put down, it is not a live vaccine, no contraindication, even in patients who have been immunized with Varivax, the chickenpox vaccine, or have had the shingles, or have had the Zostervax vaccine. So there's nobody who's contraindicated from that standpoint because they had shingles, they've had the Zoster vaccine, they had the Varivax, the childhood chickenpox vaccine, or they're immunocompromised. So it really has opened up this vaccine for lots of different people. So this is the data from the studies that were done in immunocompromised patients who had had a stem cell transplant. So they'd had a bone marrow transplant, okay? So they actually used it, and if you go over here to the right-hand side, percent efficacy, if you look at, and it's broken up by age, you've got the overall 68% effective, then you break it down by age, so you're in the 60 to 70% efficacy range for preventing them from developing herpes zoster or shingles versus the placebo group. You can see there, the percent incidence was 94.3 in the overall group developed shingles if they didn't get the vaccine. So it is a very effective vaccine. And you can see from this study, it's a very high likelihood if you're immunocompromised, you're at risk for shingles. So this is the adjusted adjuvant vaccine. So efficacy in subjects 18 and older with hematologic malignancies. The others were stem cell transplant. This is hematologic malignancies, 515 who got 2 doses of either Shingrix or placebo and did not develop confirmed case of herpes zoster within 1 month after the second dose. And the efficacy, you can see here again, 87.2%. The incidence rate per 1,000 was 8.5 versus 66.2 in the Shingrix and placebo groups respectively. So a huge difference again. So this is all from the label that was in the label. The ACIP recommended it unanimously, and the CDC has subsequently recommended this vaccine. So 2 doses, a half a cc each, IM, according to the following schedules. The first dose, month 0, followed by a second dose, 2 to 6 months later, which is the original FDA-approved dosage. But there's a change with the immunocompromised folks here. I'll show you in a minute. But if you don't get it within the 6 months, you still don't have to go back and restart the series. You can still just give the second dose when it was available, and it was in short supply. It's not anymore. So for individuals who are or will be immunodeficient, we know they're going to have a stem cell transplant. We know they're going to start chemotherapy. You can actually shorten the interval to as short as 1 month for immunocompromised patients in the current CDC guidelines. So that's also listed for you here at the bottom. So instead of 2 to 6, you can get it down to 1 month. And they would encourage you, if you know you're about to undergo a procedure or start a therapy, to go ahead and get this vaccine sooner rather than later, so that you have it on board and you're going to get the most response if they're not yet immunocompromised. But it's still safe to use even after they start their therapies or have the procedure done. And here is the, on October the 20th, the ACIP recommended 15-0. So remember, it was approved by the FDA in July. The Advisory Committee Immunization Practices, CDC, voted on October the 20th to recommend it 19 and above. And I don't know why the FDA original label was 18 and above. But the ACIP said 19 and above. And I think it's because most of the patients, there were very few that were 18 years of age in the data set that was submitted to the ACIP. So I think that's the reason for that 1 year difference. I don't think it's a big deal. And the CDC staff noted that dosing schedule at month 0 followed by a second dose, 2 to 6 months, however, if immunocompromised, 1 to 2 months. So that again was the ACIP's recommendation to the CDC back in October. Yep. Did I go one too many? So this is the MMWR, January 21, 2022. This is when it became official. So it was not official until early this year. Even though the process started last July, the ACIP voted in October, the CDC made their final recommendation and published the guidelines in January of this year in MMWR. So basically they did everything that the ACIP and the FDA had recommended. So there's no major changes in the guidelines from our friends at the CDC. But if you've had immunocompromised patients before, they couldn't get it, they now can get it, and we would encourage you to go ahead and give it to them. It's a very, very effective vaccine, and it's great that we have it, especially for this population now, because shingles is not a fun thing to have. This again is from that same publication, so you can go online and actually pull it up if you want. And basically what they're saying here, pregnancy, provided that considering delaying the recombinant zoster vaccine after pregnancy, there is no recommendation for pregnancy testing before vaccination. Breastfeeding, there's no problem at all. So if it happens during pregnancy and you give it, it's okay. But they would rather you get it before or delay after delivery, if you could, because we don't have enough data. But there's nobody believes there's a problem. Again, it's not a live vaccine. So the live vaccines are the only ones that we have typically avoided, not only during pregnancy, but also we've avoided them in immunocompromised patients. So this one has got good data now. Getting two at a time. Quick update on HPV vaccine. There was a new indication for HPV vaccine, Gardasil 9, in the last year. So the guidelines really haven't changed, but the new indication is that it is now recommended because it also reduces the risk of oral pharyngeal and head and neck cancers, suggesting that a significant number of those cancers, a very large number of those, are related to the HPV, and this vaccine covers it. So not only does it prevent cancer in the cervical area, also anal rectal and oral pharyngeal. So this is a cancer vaccine. And the target population for HPV 9, Gardasil 9, is 11 and 12-year-olds. And 11 and 12-year-olds are targeted for a specific reason, not because we anticipate they're going to be sexually active at that age. That is the age when this vaccine is most effective. You get the highest immune response with this vaccine at ages 11 and 12. And on top of that, with 11 to 14-year-olds, it's a 2-dose series as long as it's at least 6 months apart versus a 3-dose series for everybody else. Because again, the response is greater at ages 11 to 14. So the target dose by the CDC, or the target age, is 11 and 12-year-olds. And this is a cancer vaccine, not just to prevent sexually transmitted disease, that prevent malignancies. And this is a very, very effective vaccine to do that. So this is Gardasil 9. Another one that has just happened here this month in April. The CDC is now recommending universal hepatitis B vaccination for all adults aged 19 to 59. Every one of us aged 19 to 59 who has not previously received a hepatitis B series should be vaccinated with hepatitis B vaccine. Hepatitis is the leading cause of end-stage liver disease and the need for liver transplant today. It is taken over and it is out of control. So the CDC said in the past where they had targeted high-risk populations. They're saying that because we haven't done a good job getting high-risk people vaccinated, we now want to get everybody vaccinated with hepatitis B vaccine. So this is brand new. This just came out this month. And if you're 60 and above, if you have high-risk conditions, you have diabetes, anything that puts you at risk, they want you to go ahead and get it. And it's not conditional anymore. You can give anybody age 60 and above who wants the vaccine. There's no reason not to give it, but they say it's optional unless you have risk factors for those 60 and above. But 19 to 59, it is recommended. Now, if you'd already had hepatitis B vaccination, you don't need another series. It's once in a lifetime and done. If you've had it as a child, and most of us in this room would not have had it as a child because it wasn't available back then you don't need to give it again. As long as, according to the CDC's publication, April the 1st, you can document they got it and the dates they got each individual dose. So you need to be able to find documentation and the dates they were vaccinated. They say if you don't have that documentation, it's okay to go ahead and revaccinate. You don't have to test before you give the vaccine. If you want to, you can, but you don't have to test and do hepatitis surface antigen, core antibody. You don't need to do that unless you want to. You can go ahead and give the vaccine. So that's the new guidance for hepatitis B vaccines from our friends at the CDC this month. And these are the risk factors for hepatitis B that you can see here. And I won't read them all to you, but there are a long laundry list of risk factors that are here by the CDC. All persons for infection in sexual exposure, for partners of persons testing positive for hepatitis B surface antigen, for sexually active persons who are not in a long-term mutually monogamous relationship, persons more than one sex partner, because that's still, these are, hepatitis B is transmitted mainly through that process. So long laundry list all the way down on the sheet here. So those are the things, but the good news is with the new guidelines, if you're 19 to 59, you don't need to worry about those anymore. Those are the ones that were targeted in the past. Now it's everybody. So they've got it, universal hepatitis B vaccination. And this is the most controversial, not so much controversial, but most confusing thing I'm going to tell you about all week. The pneumococcal vaccines. This is a moving target. About 8 or 9 years ago, we had Prevnar 13 recommended for all adults at age 65, based on a study that was done by our friends at Pfizer and Wyeth that showed it reduced the risk of invasive pneumococcal disease and pneumococcal pneumonia in people 65 and above. But your number needed to treat was over 2,000 patients. But the CDC recommended it anyway. Then, because we were using Prevnar 13 in kids routinely, was the preferred childhood vaccine, the case rate for adults getting those strains of infection went down dramatically. So the CDC said, we'll now make that one optional. So Prevnar 13 became a Class B or an optional recommendation, but they wanted us to all get at age 65 Pneumovax 23, the polysaccharide vaccine. Now, just a couple of things before we go further. The polysaccharide vaccine has 23 strains of pneumococci in it. Prevnar 20 has 20, and Prevnar 13, the one that's going to go away eventually, only had 13. And if you remember before Prevnar 13, we had Prevnar 7. And what happens is, once we give a vaccine against those specific strains, those strains are suppressed, but other strains pop up and go up in prevalence. So that's why they went from 7 to 13, and now why they have a Prevnar 20. Because we're seeing about 40% of the cases of invasive pneumococcal disease and pneumococcal pneumonia today are due to the strains that are not in Prevnar 13. So by giving Prevnar 20, we're going to cover most of those strains. So the CDC and the manufacturer continue to monitor what strains are causing disease, and they continue to modify the vaccine. So now I'm going to give you a heads up on what to expect next year, because Merck's bringing out another one yet. It's investigational, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. So Prevnar 20 will eventually replace Prevnar 13. It does for adults, but not for kids. Kids still get Prevnar 13. And the reason kids get Prevnar 13 today instead of Pneumovax 23 is Pneumovax doesn't work in pediatric patients. Their immune system is not sophisticated enough for that vaccine to be very effective. The conjugated vaccines are more effective. So we went from Prevnar 7 to Prevnar 13 for routine pediatric administration. But we don't have any data yet with Prevnar 20 or Vacnuvance, which is PCV 15 by Merck, but both of those are in the works. So we'll have data probably by the end of this year, if not middle of this year, with Merck's vaccine against those strains in pediatric patients. So this is all going to be subject to change yet again. And if that happens, Prevnar 13 will go away. But right now, there's no indication for Prevnar 13 for adults, only for pediatric patients. I would not even use it as the optional vaccine that was in the guidelines until this year anymore. So Prevnar 13 should not be routinely used in adults. So Prevnar 20 is out there, and they are doing a confirmatory clinical trials. These new vaccines were approved by the FDA and the CDC's recommendations on a contingent process because they had not submitted data in a clinical trial. The trials were what happened to the immune response against these various strains. So we have that data in humans over time, but we don't have outcomes as far as pneumonia or invasive pneumococcal disease. Those trials are still underway. So that's why a confirmatory trial is still being required by both the FDA and the CDC. And if those trials do, yes. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. All right. We'll come back to that in just a minute. So this is Prevnar 20. And this shows you more than half the cases of all invasive pneumococcal disease. That includes meningitis. That includes bacteremia. In adults 65 and older are due to the 20 serotypes in Prevnar 20. And about 250,000 cases of invasive pneumococcal disease and 10,000 deaths in adults 18 and older. The 7 additional strains are responsible for about 40% of all pneumococcal cases and death. So that's why it's important to move from 13 to 20. Okay, and this data is actually from the CDC. Now, at the same time, within a couple of weeks, Merck brought out PCV 15, which is their first conjugated vaccine. And it's Vacnuvance. We have Prevnar 20 and Vacnuvance. We have them both approved last year. And this was in July of last year. And they've never had the conjugated vaccine before. They've only had the polysaccharide vaccine that had 23 strains in it. Okay? And again, anticipate that they would be evaluated, and they have now been evaluated. So ACIP has met and CDC has made some recommendations. So MMWR, January the 28th of this year, published these updated recommendations for pneumococcal vaccines. So this is brand new in January of this year. So adults 65 and older who have not previously received PCV. So I had PCV 13 at age 65, and a year later had Pneumovax 23. So I don't qualify to get PCV 20 or Vacnuvance 15 because I've already had a dose of a conjugated pneumococcal vaccine. So many of us that are older or chronologically gifted, like I like to call us, and in my case, follically impaired and optically challenged, not a candidate for this vaccine, okay? But they also say if I give PCV 15, it should be followed by a dose of PPSV 23 a year later. They don't say that for Prevnar 20. So if you give Prevnar 20, it's once and done. If you give Vacnuvance 15, you have to wait a year and then give a dose of Pneumovax 23. Now, what happened in between these new guidelines and when we went with PCV 13 optional? Everybody was supposed to get PPSV 23 at age 65. So there's a large number of folks out there who have had Pneumovax 23, but they've not yet had a conjugated vaccine. And in that case, they are a candidate for one of these two vaccines, but they don't need another dose of PPSV 23 unless they got it before age 65. Confusing enough? And stay tuned because there's going to be another one vaccine coming yet. And so there's a whole lot of different ramifications or possibilities when it comes to these vaccines. Said when PCV 15 is used, the recommended interval between the administration of PCV 15 and 23 is 1 year or more. Minimum interval of 8 weeks can be considered for adults with immunocompromising condition. The rationale, this is a quirk in our healthcare system. This is thanks to our friends at Medicare and Medicaid, mainly Medicare. Turns out that if you're under 65, you're not covered typically with the Medicare. So with Medicare comes in at age 65, Medicare will only pay for 2 pneumococcal vaccines if the request or the payment request is submitted at least 11 months apart. If you submit the payment request in less than 11 months between them, they'll deny the second one. They only cover it if it's at least 11 months apart. So since that was what Medicare was doing, CMS, CDC said, we'll say 1 year for those 65 and older. Even if you get the conjugated vaccine first, you wait a year to get the PPSV 23. But they say if you're immunocompromised, then it's still okay to go ahead and get it. It's not clinically harmful, it's the coverage. That's the rationale. Does that make sense? So lots of little quirks here. Yes? Okay, if you were immunocompromised, you have a high risk, and you got Prevnar 13 as an adult, but before age 65, at age 65, there's no more doses of the conjugated vaccine. As an adult, 1 dose of conjugated vaccine in your lifetime, and that's all you need. But you were recommended to get, and still are recommended to get, a dose of PPSV 23 because you did not get Prevnar 20 between 19 and 59 years of age. Does that make sense? Because if you got Prevnar 13, which is where most of these people were until now, you got a dose of PPSV 23 at least 8 weeks later. You got a second dose 5 years after that. And then once you hit age 65, you got a third dose of PPSV 23. That was the current guideline, or the guideline until January, for everybody with high-risk conditions. Now the high risk is you can give Prevnar 20 before age 65, and then at age 65, you don't have to give anything. Okay? And there was no follow-up if you give Prevnar 20. There was no PPSV 23, even in immunocompromised patients, based on this current guideline. But if you use Vacnuvance, then you still have to come in with PPSV 23 5 years after your immunocompromised patient if they're less than 65, and then that's it. You don't need to give another one. Yes. I'm not sure I follow the question. Give me an age and what vaccine they got. Age 40, what vaccine were they given? Prevnar 13? Yep. They would still get a dose of PPSV 23 at age 65 because they hadn't had a dose before. And even if they got a dose before, they'd still get a dose of PPSV 23 at age 65 now.
So does 20 fall in line? So like
The 20, no, they're not a candidate for the 20 because they've already had a conjugated vaccine in the past as an adult. So at one dose of conjugated vaccine, any of the three as an adult, and you're done with that vaccine. So it could have been PCV 13, PCV 15, or PCV 20. And get ready because there's another one's going to have more. We're not through. Again, this is that guideline from the ACIP and the CDC. And again, I don't think there's anything we haven't already covered here. These are the specifically unifying medical conditions where they are recommended to get some of these vaccines at an earlier age. And you can see this long laundry list over here. So alcoholism, chronic heart disease, that includes heart failure, chronic liver disease, chronic lung disease, COPD and asthma, smokers, diabetes, cochlear implant, CSF leak, congenital or quad A splenius, that would be our sickle cell patients, sickle cell disease or other hemoglobinopathies, renal failure, acquired immunodeficiencies, generalized HIV infection, Hodgkin's disease, you go on down the line. So those are the high risk groups, and those would get them before age 65. And you would give them, if you give Prevnar 23, that's all you need. If you give Vacnuvance, you give Vacnuvance, and at least 8 weeks later, you come back and give PPSV 23. Okay? But I believe that Merck is probably going to do away with Vacnuvance in a couple of years. So it's new, but I think it's going to go away. Updated recommendations again from January. Cost effectiveness. They suggest that the PCV 20 is the most cost effective of these new vaccines. So their evaluation is Prevnar 20 is the best one right now, but I'll bet they moved that one to the new Merck one when I show you that one in just a minute. But we will have outcome data with all these over time. Right now, it's only the immune response. And the immune response is similar with PCV 20 to the 13 strains that are still in PCV 13, and also with Vacnuvance 15. So this is V1116, Merck's investigational 21-valent pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. So this one is in the pipeline right now, and the FDA gave it breakthrough status actually this past week from the FDA. So it's going to be evaluated, and they say it accounts for 85% of all invasive pneumococcal disease in those 65 and older, and it includes 8 serotypes not covered by currently licensed vaccines. So this is not complete overlap with Prevnar 20. They have targeted the strains that are causing the most disease. So they've dropped some that were in Prevnar 20, and they've added some that have not been there. So this is the new one that Merck has, but it's still under investigation to look at the immune response, let alone an outcome trial. So it's not approved yet, it's not available, it's not in the guidelines. But this is something just happened this week. The FDA gave it that breakthrough status. Okay, decision informed by data from a 2-part randomized comparator double-blind phase 1/2 trial that assessed the safety and tolerability of a single dose in vaccine-naive adults 18 to 49, phase 1, and 50 and older in phase 2. And full results are yet to be presented at a scientific meeting. So the FDA has seen the data, preliminary data, and gave it breakthrough status based on that. But it's not approved, it's not available, it's investigational. Okay, so that's also in the pipeline. So what can I tell you about for these first couple of vaccines? I know Charlene had some questions online, but any other questions on these first 3 vaccines we talked about? Charlene?
One patient, one question was, if the patient age 66 has shingles, but is not immunocompromised, when would you give them shingles?
Great question. Question was, if I got somebody who's 66 years old, who's had shingles but has not been immunized, what about giving them the vaccine? The CDC does not have a recommendation to withhold dosing or starting the series, except they want you to wait until the acute shingles episode is over. But our friends at Kaiser Permanente in California had done a study with the old Zostavax. Now, this is not with Shingrix, so I can't tell you it would apply, but with Zostavax, and they found there was limited benefit giving the Zosta vaccine to somebody who's just recovered from shingles for 1 to 2 years after they had shingles. And theoretically, the reason for that is, having had shingles, you've already stimulated your immune system to the max because you've had an active case. And your titers start to decline after 1 to 2 years. And that's when they found it was most appropriate to give the Zostavax vaccine. Now, I don't have that same study with Shingrix, but it makes sense to me. But the CDC says there's no reason to withhold the vaccine after somebody's recovered from an acute episode of shingles. Okay, so that's the best I can do with that question. Other questions?
Okay, there was one other question that said that she had a lot of type 1 diabetics that were younger people. I think she said like a 50 to 21 year age group. Should they get Shingrix vaccine?
Okay. The Shingrix vaccine is not approved for kids, but remember, it also does not prevent chickenpox. It's not been studied for that. We don't have any data for that in kids. That's the Varivax vaccine, and hopefully these kids that she's talking about, they would have been around at the time that Varivax has been available, which is, again, is a live attenuated vaccine. It's the Merck strain that's live and attenuated, the same one that was in Zostavax. But Zostavax was 14 times more concentrated than Varivax. Okay, so it's a much more potent vaccine because as we got older, we don't respond to the same levels of the antigen. In this case, the live attenuated vaccine. But because they've had Varivax vaccine, we don't have any indication that type 1 diabetics should need to get shingles vaccine at a younger age. So again, you can do it, but I would wait until they're at least 18 years of age, because that's where the guidelines are and that's where the studies are. I don't have studies in that patient population less than 18 years of age. And again, most of those have all gotten Varivax vaccine, except if they were immunocompromised or had one of those high-risk conditions when they were pediatric patients, and that many times that's not the case, or we haven't found out about it yet. So most of those kids had received Varivax or the chickenpox vaccine, which is the same virus that causes shingles. Okay.
Probably the answer is the other question. That was what percentage of young immunocompromised patients had varicella vaccination? And then to have varicella vaccination, then had Shingrix. But probably, I would think that because of what the chickenpox vaccine has been out for, what, 20
Long time.
Yeah, so.
but not long enough to cover many of us in this room. I didn't get chickenpox vaccine. I got chickenpox and I went to a chickenpox party. The moms got together and put the kids in so we'd all get it at the same time. I imagine we had fun, but I don't recall it. Any other questions, Charlene, on the chat? Okay. This is going to switch gears a little bit to the COVID vaccines. This again is a moving target. This is not done yet. There's going to be a lot more things to come. But this is some data from March the 14th from Johns Hopkins website. And if you look at the United States, we've had confirmed cases, almost 80 million cases of COVID confirmed in the United States. Total deaths, almost 1 million. Confirmed cases per million, about 242,000. Look down the list here. There's only 2 countries that are higher confirmed cases per million population, and that's France and United Kingdom. Deaths per million population, we have almost 3,000, and Brazil is the only country that's higher than us. Percent of the population partially vaccinated. It's 11% in the US, fully vaccinated, 65%. And only India is less than the United States. Every other country on here has a higher percentage of fully vaccinated patients than we do. Okay, and these are the ones that have the highest rates or the highest incidence of the disease, according to our friends at Johns Hopkins. So we've got a ways to go. This is from last August. The FDA approved the first FDA-approved COVID vaccine. Our friends at Pfizer and BioNTech, and the name is Comirnaty, for ages 16 and above, as well as a 3-month extension on the expiration dates of those original series of vaccines that came out. Once the FDA approval, you're not at risk for giving an off-label booster if you're under the EUA. So we couldn't give a booster under the EUA initially, but once it became FDA approved, you could give it off-label. You weren't at risk. The vaccine is also indicated under the current emergency use authorization for a booster. Patients are immunocompromised or post-transplant. Boosters appear to increase titers by 10 to 20-fold over the post-second dose, but are age-related. As we get older, the response is a little less, why we may need even a 4th dose for older folks now. And I just had my 4th dose a couple of weeks ago. So this is the ACIP vote on the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine for boosters in September. Remember, the drug was approved in August, but not for boosters. That was still not on the label. And the CDC committee reviewed the evidence and agreed unanimously that an extra shot for adults over 65. 2 of the 15 panelists voted against booster doses for adults over age 50 with a certain medical conditions. So everybody agreed 65 and above, and all but 2 agreed ages 50 and above. Approval for booster of people's 18 to 49 with other medical conditions squeaked by in a vote of 9-6, and becoming a recommendation for people whose occupations put them at risk did not pass. So for healthcare workers, for those in emergency medical systems, ER workers, hospital work, all those folks did not pass through the ACIP, but it doesn't mean that CDC is not going to make a recommendation. So here's the November 19th, we have this US CDC Advisory Committee on Immunizations, ACIP, voted to recommend the use of a booster dose of the Moderna vaccine, but only 50 micrograms, and the recommended primary dose is 100 micrograms. So it's half dose. Pfizer's booster is the same as the original 2 doses. It's 30 micrograms. So the adult doses of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine are 30 micrograms. The booster is 30 micrograms. Moderna is 100 micrograms for the first 2 doses, and the booster is 50, half dose. Okay, so there's a difference in the dosing. Vote was unanimous with 11 members recommending the booster of the Moderna vaccine. And here's the FDA announced emergency use authorization for the J&J vaccine for booster dose of the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine, at least 2 months after completion of a single dose of the J&J vaccine for those 18 and above. Then the use of available COVID vaccines as a heterologous, you can mix them or match according to the CDC, is okay, but they're actually going to come back and amend this to say, if you got the Janssen vaccine for your 1 dose, you're probably better off getting either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine as your booster because they're more effective. And we should have never approved the J&J vaccine with 1 dose. It should have been at least a 2-dose series because it doesn't last as long. And we found that out over time. So this is the recommendations, and this is as of this year, the schedule for immunizations. So you look at Pfizer BioNTech. 5 to 11-year-olds now has an emergency use authorization. It's not in the label. It's emergency use authorization for those kids. And look at the dose. It's 10 micrograms. It's 1/3 the dose, and it's actually a different vial. Okay? The adult dose originally had a purple vial that you had to reconstitute. Then they went to a gray colored cap that was already in solution. You didn't have to reconstitute it. And that's the one we generally have now. It's 30 micrograms per dose. Then they brought out an orange cap that is the 10 microgram dose. And look, the interval between the first and second dose is still 3 weeks. And the interval of primary and booster, not yet at this time a booster because we're waiting on the data. Then you look at 12 to 16 or to 18 years of age, 12 and above, it's still a 30 microgram, which is the adult dose down to age 12. And it is number of boosters is 1, primary series is 2, and the booster is 5 months or later. So you get 3 weeks between the first and second, and 5 months between the second and third, and all the doses are the same. Okay? Then you look at the Moderna vaccine, which is 100 micrograms for the 2 primary doses, at least 4. But I'm going to suggest to you the guidelines are actually preferring we wait 8 weeks instead of 4. And the reason for that is it appears that the myocarditis, pericarditis that we see in young males, adolescent males, may be less likely to occur if we use an 8-week interval rather than a 4-week interval. That's coming out of subsequent data from the UK, from the US, and from Canada. The Moderna data suggesting Moderna had a higher rate of myocarditis and pericarditis based on the follow-up data, and it appears the duration between doses may affect that. They still believe the benefit far outweighs the risk, but you may be able to reduce the risk if you delay it, and that's talked about a little bit down here. And then the booster is 50 micrograms at least 5 months after the second dose. And then when you look at the J&J vaccine, you've got 1 dose, 18 and above, and number of boosters is 1, at least 2 months after, but they would prefer that booster be with the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. The messenger RNA vaccines are more effective. So this is some data on the interval between, and the high-risk group here for males 12 to 39, but especially those 12 to 17, maybe waiting 8 weeks is going to reduce the risk of myocarditis. And if you do develop it, it tends to be mild and self-limited. Does not appear to cause significant harm based on the data we have so far. This may be hard to read, but this is an update, February the 22nd. looking at additional booster doses. So booster dose at least 3 months after the third dose, so a fourth dose of the Pfizer or a fourth dose of the Moderna vaccine. So those of us who are over age 50 or 65 with or without risk factors are now can get a fourth dose. So this is new, and this is CDC recommendation. And they also say here, again, your additional doses, mRNA vaccine for the people who get J&J for the first dose, all their subsequent doses should be with the other two vaccines. Again, they're more effective. This is the moderate severe immunocompromising conditions that are listed. These are all candidates for a fourth dose. These were the first group to get a fourth dose of the mRNA vaccines, either Pfizer or Moderna. And this is data out of Israel on a fourth dose for other people, including healthcare workers. And again, suggesting that even after the third dose, the titers decline fairly rapidly. And by giving the fourth dose, you boost them back up again. We don't know how long they're going to last. And just to give you a perspective on the vaccines today versus the strains of COVID that we have. Originally, the vaccines were more effective than having had and recovered from the original strains of COVID. The vaccines were better than getting the disease and recovering. When it came to the Delta strain and the Omicron strain, or now the newest Omicron variant, it appears that having had the disease and recovering is a little more effective than the vaccine. So the vaccine is not as targeted to these new strains right now. And because of that, all the manufacturers are reworking the vaccines to see if they can broaden the coverage to cover these additional strains. The other thing they're doing is we have in the pipeline right now combined vaccines. With messenger RNA technology, it's possible to put influenza, COVID, multiple strains of influenza, and RSV in the same vaccine. So within the next year, it would not surprise me if we don't have a vaccine that be one vaccine for COVID with multiple strains, influenza with multiple strains, and RSV all in one vaccine. It's been said by some of the vaccine experts in the world, and one that I really like is Dr. Paul Sachs, who's a pediatric vaccine specialist at the hospital and University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And he actually is on record as saying, we could have a vaccine that has 20 or 30 different diseases covered in one vaccine with this new technology. And messenger RNA technology is not new. It's been around for over 15 to 20 years. It's just that we now have some vaccines, and they didn't come overnight. This was stuff that was in the works before COVID came about. So these vaccines were all being investigated way before we discovered COVID. So stay tuned, because we may see a wholesale change in vaccines. And I would predict over the next 10 years, none of these vaccines we're using right now will be in use today. We'll have new vaccines that will cover more diseases more effectively in combined vaccines. So don't know where it's going to go yet, but stay tuned.
We'll still have people refusing to get them.
Oh yeah, we'll still have people refusing to get them. There's no question about it. Or thinking that there's a chip in it that we can now track you from your vaccine. We'll sterilize you. You can't get pregnant. All those things that there's not good evidence for at all. And it's not going to change your DNA. It does not change your DNA. Sorry. I won't get political if I can help it. Whoop. So the new booster dose we've already talked about for the Pfizer BioNTech with the 4 doses, and also with the Moderna. And this is the data in kids. We have great data 12 to 15, and we have some data from 5 to 11. Where we don't have data yet is 6 months to 4 years of age. And we thought we were going to have that data earlier this month. It's now been delayed at least until June. And the reason being, Pfizer found out, again, they'd reduced the dose. Again, they went from 30 to 10. They went down to 3 micrograms for kids 2 months to 4 years of age. And they did not get the same immune response in the early clinical trials. So it was much less effective in these kids using that dose. So we will probably see what they did. They actually gave a third dose as part of the primary series in the trials for those kids. The FDA had originally requested Pfizer submit the data so that they could get this stuff out sooner rather than later, but decided, based on the evidence I'm going to show you, the efficacy is not so great. So they decided to wait for the results of the third dose. And we don't know if we're going to get these guys approved for kids 2 months to 4 years of age yet. So that's still a work in progress. And again, it's a third different dose. And the 3 microgram dose had a purple cap. So again, it's a different dose. The vaccine changed slightly. And with the pediatric dose 5 to 11, that orange cap has a different buffer than the old purple cap. So there was a different buffer as well. So the doses are different, and we need to pay attention to which vaccine we give, because Pfizer would likely have 3 or 4 different versions of the COVID vaccine with BioNTech. This is the data. If we look at the COVID-19, 7 days post-dose 2 was 90.7% in 5 to 11-year-olds, and safety data was good. In fact, the safety data, they didn't have any cases of allergic reactions, no anaphylaxis, and no cases of myocarditis or pericarditis with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine in 5 to 11-year-olds at the time this was submitted to the FDA advisory committee last fall. So the advisory committee on 10/26/21 voting question: based on the totality of scientific evidence available, do the benefits of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, when administered as a 2-dose series, 10 micrograms each dose, 3 weeks apart, outweigh its risk for use in children 5 to 11? And basically, they voted to recommend the 10 microgram dose to kids at 1/3 the adult dose. And basically, one of the folks on the committee and the director of vaccine division said, this is a major advance. We need to go ahead and get this out. That was at the October advisory committee meeting. Later that month, the FDA issued emergency use authorization for Pfizer's vaccine for kids 5 to 11. First one that goes down to less than age 12. And they recommended it routinely. So this is the recommendation. Again, a slide from our friends at the CDC. And the dosings are listed here for the different vaccines. And you don't have recommendations currently from Moderna or J&J for kids, only for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Moderna is in the process of submitting their data for children with their vaccine right now. This is the different color caps and just the reconstitution. The purple cap I don't believe is being sold anymore. The gray cap is the one that's already diluted, and the orange cap for kids still has to be diluted or reconstituted. And the one that 3 micrograms, if it gets approved, I'm told will have a burgundy or purple, reddish cap. 6 months to 5 years of age. This is the emergency use authorization they originally looked at. And basically, your younger kids, they have not approved because the efficacy does not appear so great. With the 2 doses, wasn't hot at all. Third dose, we're waiting. They anticipate maybe having the data submitted by June. So stay tuned. We could have information in June, but doesn't mean it'll be approved. This again is some subsequent data that we have with the emergence of Omicron variants with children 5 to 17 years of age, and it still reduces hospitalizations, but it is not great when it comes to preventing the disease. So this is data, I believe, out of the state of New York. And from December 13, 21 through January 30, 22, 852,000 fully vaccinated children, 12 to 17. If you look at the 5 to 11-year-olds, vaccine efficacy against declined from 66% to 51% for those 12 to 17, and from 68% to 12% in those that are 5 to 11. During the January 24, 30th week, efficacy for 11-year-olds was 11%, and you can see for 12-year-olds, 67%. Hospitalization declined from 85% to 73% in those 12 to 17, and 100% to 48% for those 5 to 11. So the efficacy of the vaccine, especially for 5 to 11-year-olds, appears to be less with a 2-dose series to prevent the disease, but it's still very effective against preventing hospitalization and bad outcomes. So again, stay tuned. We'll see whether they change this to a 3-dose series for the primary immunization and boosters again. So like I said, it's a work in progress. As we get more data, hopefully it's going to continue to change. 5 to 11-year-olds, again, inclusion of relevance, Omicron, the effectiveness against the Pfizer-BioNTech declined rapidly, especially for 5 to 11-year-olds. Vaccination 5 to 11 was protective against severe disease and is recommended. And right now, it's the only vaccine we have that we can give 5 to 11-year-olds. And we have no vaccine recommendation for those less than 5 years of age. Okay? Moderna, on January 31st, had their vaccine approved by the FDA. It's called Spikevax. So that's the official name of it's the same vaccine that we've been using under emergency use authorization, but it's only for 18 and above. There's no recommendation. They haven't submitted data yet. They're in the process of looking at older children, but don't have it yet. Same formulation. Spikevax, FDA conducted a rigorous evaluation post-authorization, including myocarditis and pericarditis, and it appeared that Spikevax or the Moderna vaccine was more likely to cause it. And again, maybe they're adolescent males or younger males, and if you wait 8 weeks instead of 4 weeks between doses, it appears to reduce the risk significantly. And again, almost everybody who's developed the myocarditis has had resolution of symptoms quickly, and those symptoms include chest pain, shortness of breath, feeling of having a fast heart rate, fluttering, or a pounding heart. That's what they presented with. Moderna vaccines in children looks promising, but again, it's not been evaluated. Stay tuned, but it's coming hopefully sooner rather than later. The Pfizer vaccine in kids, I already told you about, and the FDA decided to hold off on reviewing the data until we get the full data set for the 3rd dose, because the efficacy is not there.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
How soon after the vaccine are we seeing the pericarditis or the myocarditis?
It appears to occur fairly quickly after either dose. So it's not something that occurs late, and then it resolves pretty quickly. And again, it was not seen at all in the pediatric studies that Pfizer-BioNTech did. So I don't know if it's in the data set with Moderna yet, because we haven't seen that data yet for kids, but it's coming. And we should see it anytime, almost any day now. And the one place you can check all this data is the FDA, when they have an advisory committee meeting, they will put the data set online that you can go on and access even before the advisory committee meeting. So you can look at the data they're going to evaluate and get the FDA's review on it as well. You'll get what the company submitted and the FDA's recommendation before the committee ever meets. And it's free. You can just go online and sign up to get that. Our friends at Novavax have not yet had an FDA approved or emergency use authorization, but that vaccine is also in the pipeline. So stay tuned. Hopefully Novavax will also have a COVID-19 vaccine. And it's a 2 half-mil doses, 5 micrograms of the antigen, and with an adjuvant, given IM 21 days apart is the way it's studied. So stay tuned. We'll see what happens with this one, whether it gets approved or not. Yeah. So this one's more like the J&J or the also AstraZeneca vaccine we have. So this one's not an mRNA. This is the new recommendations from the CDC and NIH for treatment of patients non-hospitalized COVID infection. People who are at high risk who get COVID, and if we can treat them within ideally 3 days to 5 days, this is the new recommendation. And this has changed again as even of this week. There are only 2 drugs on here that have great efficacy. The first one is an oral one that is new, Paxlovid. Paxlovid is Pfizer's antiviral that's combined with ritonavir. And the reason ritonavir is added to it is this drug is metabolized by cytochrome P450 3A4. Ritonavir is a potent 3A4 inhibitor. So it inhibits the metabolism or breakdown of the antiviral, raising the levels higher. So it's ritonavir boosted, if you will, with the antiviral. It's twice a day for 5 days. Okay? And it is the preferred. These are listed in order of preference by the NIH review committee. So Paxlovid is the recommended drug in the guidelines. And as of this week, they're trying to get more pharmacies to have it. Right now, it was very limited distribution. And usually the government sent it to your state health department, who decided which pharmacies in your area would get it. So in my area, I have 1 free clinic, 1 federally funded health clinic, Franklin C. Fetter. I have MUSC, where I am, and I have Walgreens, and I have a CVS that have Paxlovid. And I'll show you in a minute how you can find out where they are. But it turns out it's not being used like the CDC would like it to be used. And you'll see it's very, very effective. So this week, the CDC announced with the Department of Health and Human Services, they hope to increase the number of pharmacies that can get it. And Dr. Sachs, who I mentioned to you before, from the Immunization Advisory Committee at Philadelphia Children's Hospital, said one of the ways to increase availability is to open it up for pharmacists to prescribe it. This one has not been allowed for pharmacists to prescribe. Physicians, nurse practitioners, PAs have been able to prescribe it, but pharmacists have not. And that was not true for some of these other drugs in the past. So it turns out that we can actually, depending on what your state health department tells you you can and can't do, or your state board of pharmacy, stay tuned, because this is a new recommendation that we open it up. Yes?
High-risk people.
Yep.
Any logic to have that prescription already filled and before you get the disease?
Probably not, because we don't have enough of the drug.
Given us up 3 to 5 days.
You got to be able to, if they have any symptoms, they need to be tested. And right now they're saying if you're tested, even with a home test and it's positive, we would hope that you could go to one of the places that has it, and the drug is free. The government has paid for the drug. It's not FDA approved. It's emergency use authorization, Paxlovid, and you get the course for free. If you had to pay for it, it'd be about a $700 prescription to get a 5-day course. Yes. Paxlovid, Paxlovid. Paxlovid by Pfizer, and it's a combination of the antiviral plus ritonavir. And because it has ritonavir in it, you got to watch for lots of drug-drug interactions. So any drugs that are on that are major 3A4 substrates are going to be interacted with this drug. So simvastatin, lovastatin, some of your calcium channel blockers, nifedipine, nicardipine, felodipine are all metabolized by 3A4, and those levels will go through the roof if you add the ritonavir boosted Paxlovid to their therapy for those 5 days. So the only major thing you have to watch for with this drug is drug interactions with 3A4. And it's an oral drug approved down to 12 years of age or to 40 kgs under the emergency use authorization. So anybody who's at risk for a bad outcome or hospitalization, it's approved to go ahead and use under the emergency use authorization, and they want to encourage you to go and get it and administer it twice a day for 5 days, and you're done. Okay? If you're hospitalized, you're on oxygen, those kind of things, we have other therapies that I didn't put in this slide, but this is not for those folks. These are for people that are elderly, those who are in a nursing home, those who have complicating diseases, diabetes, heart failure, lung disease, alcoholism, and they get a positive test, they're at high risk for a bad outcome, go ahead and treat them sooner rather than later, twice a day for 5 days, and you reduce the risk of needing hospitalization by about 89%. So the efficacy of this drug is right at 90% at preventing hospitalization and bad outcomes. And that's why it's rated as #1 in this guideline. There are 4 therapies here, but only 2 of them are worthwhile. But again, it's not FDA approved, it's an emergency use authorization. So this is their statement. Again, with Paxlovid, the antiviral is 300 milligrams with 100 milligrams of ritonavir, Paxlovid, twice a day for 5 days as soon as possible within 5 days of symptom onset in those 12 and above weigh 40 kgs or more. That's the indication on the emergency use authorization. Significant drug interactions, and it's boosted with the ritonavir. And here's a reference again, drug, and that's a live link. You can click it. Investigative antiviral candidate, Paxlovid, 1,200 non-hospitalized adults 18 and older who were increased risk for progressing to severe disease got the drug within 3 to 5 days, and no deaths in the treatment group seen within 5 days of symptoms, and treatment emergent adverse effects comparable between Paxlovid and placebo, most of which were mild in intensity. The recommendation, independent data safety committee, they stopped the study early, and Pfizer agreed with the FDA and the CDC to go ahead and close out the study early because it was so effective. 89% reduction. So this is, again, with that drug, 3 of 389 hospitalized with no deaths versus 7% who got placebo were hospitalized and 7 subsequent deaths. So the number needed to treat is 16 to prevent hospitalization and death with the drug. And again, it's free, it's oral, and it's twice a day for 5 days within 5 days of symptom onset. And it does work against the Omicron strain. So the trial was called the phase 2-3 combined EPIC-SR evaluation, and good efficacy, good safety, and they're doing more work with it, but it's available, emergency use. Yes?
Regarding the drug-drug interactions, stop taking the statin for how many days post-treatment?
Probably most of the statins, if you stop for a couple of days after you complete the therapy, you're probably fine. Yeah. But the interactions can be significant because ritonavir is probably the most potent 3A4 inhibitor known to man. And if you look at what happens with ritonavir with simvastatin, it goes up like 300-fold. And that's really going to increase your risk of rhabdo. Good news is we don't use a whole lot of simvastatin today. It's been replaced by atorva, but atorva still will interact some, so I'd still do the same thing with atorva. Again, EUA, and again, it's at least 40 kgs, and it's not indicated for those who are hospitalized or on oxygen therapy. Again, some more information, tablets, tablet size, with or without food, and dosing moderate to renal impairment, eGFR greater than 30, less than 60. Then it's one tablet with the 100 milligram tablet taken once a day or twice a day for 5 days. Statement from the panel statement. This is number 2, but this one has just been withdrawn because it's not very effective against the Omicron strain. So even though this was just recommended by the NIH guideline, they've just put this one on hold, just like they put the Lilly and Regeneron monoclonal antibodies on hold. They're not making those available right now because Omicron's not affected by them. So even though GSK came out with this one does not have good efficacy against the Omicron strain, so it's not recommended anymore. It's not going to be made available by the Department of Health and Human Services. And this is the data when it was to be available. You see the states, various states that it's been withdrawn from because of the Omicron. And Omicron is now the predominant strain, or the Omicron variant at least, so not going to use this one. We'll go past this one. Number 3, this is the second line drug now in the guidelines, and this was just updated this week within its label. This now is FDA approved down to 28 days of age for kids down to 4 weeks old. Remdesivir Velcade, which is the IV drug for hospitalized patients and for non-hospitalized patients, they can go in and get 1 IV dose a day for 3 days. And that's why it's not the first line drug, because it requires you to come in once a day for 3 days and get 3 IV doses within 7 days of symptom onset, and originally was for those 12 and above. It's now down to 28 days of age. That just happened this week. So it's not in the slides, but this week. So FDA added non-hospitalized to the label in January the 21st, and they just updated it again this week for kids down to 28 days old. And this is also useful in the hospital, but this is for non-hospitalized patients. Same indication as Paxlovid. So these are the 2 recommended therapies. Paxlovid is preferred. This is second line now. And this is the Pine Tree trial that got it approved, mainly in adults, and at the time there were only 8 pediatric patients. And you can see 2 patients, or 0.7% remdesivir versus 15 or 5% were hospitalized with placebo, and that's basically a hazard ratio of 0.13. So it's a 87% reduction, and number needed treat is 22. With 16 for Paxlovid, it's 22 here. Very effective therapy, including Omicron strains and Omicron variants. So these are really the 2 that we can use to treat patients who we want to treat in the office or before they need hospitalization, to prevent hospitalization. And then number 4 was Merck's drug, but this one, the efficacy was only 30% to start with, even before we had the Omicron strains. And for whatever reason, it went from a 50% reduction in hospitalization, which we thought was pretty good, to a 30% between the time they gave the interim data until they met with the FDA to present their final presentation. The FC went down by another 20%. And it also appears to be mutagenic and therefore cannot be used in pregnant patients. So this one is last line and is available again through the same pharmacies that the state health departments have made available Paxlovid, but it's not preferred. Paxlovid is preferred, and the good news is there's a lot more Paxlovid out there than we're using right now. And that's why they want to expand the number of pharmacies and encourage us to use it sooner rather than later. We've not been doing a good job identifying and treating these patients. This is again, the data with, I already told you, went down to about 30% effective. And this is emergency use authorization. It's not approved. None of these are FDA approved except remdesivir. It's the only one that has an FDA approval. This is another new one that's out there that, again, has some preliminary data, but it's not in the guidelines yet. I'm not going to dwell on it. And just as the last one, we'll take a break. This is from GoodRx. GoodRx.com is one of the two places you can go to find out where you can get these drugs in your area. You put in the zip code and tell you want Paxlovid, and it'll tell you which pharmacies have it and how many courses they have in stock. You can also go to a website from CMS that'll do the same thing. So there are two places you can go to see what pharmacies in your area have it and how many courses they have, where you can get it, so you don't have to call all over town to find out who has it and who doesn't. So even if they're supposedly have it, you don't know if they have any courses left. You can go on the website and see how many courses they supposedly have left. And again, it's free. You don't pay for this drug. Our tax dollars have already paid for it. So you've already paid for it on the front end. Okay? Yes? What's that? Oh, the cost would be $700 if we had to pay for it. Oh, it's renal impairment. Again, most of these patients can still use it. You may have to reduce the dose. Okay? Yeah, so what you would do is the emergency use authorization lists all the recommendations that you need to follow. And you need to report that back because they're giving you the drug to dispense. So you have to report that you have a positive test. You have to give them the information on the patient and what you gave them. So that's part of the process of giving this drug away for free. They're still collecting data by doing that. So you can do that through these sites. Okay? I've not been involved in any of this. Any of you work in a site that has it?
I spoke with a pharmacist last week. He said that in patients where the dose is lowered, only 20 tablets, instead of 30 is dispensed, they are removing 10, but I don't know what they're doing with the other 10 tablets.
I would assume they can still use those for other patients.
Wasteful.
Right. Somebody else back here? I can't hear you, sir.
You have to waste, there's a process to waste the other.
Yeah. You have to document, yeah. And that's a shame that you'd have to waste them because it's in short supply, or it was supposedly in short supply, but they say we've got lots of them there now, so. Okay.
Websites to go to?
Yeah, the one is the goodrx.com. Okay, that's where this slide comes from. And then there's also one that's linked on the CDC website. So you can go to the CDC website and find out where you can get it, as well as GoodRx.
COVID Therapeutics Finder.
Yep.
Is the key.
And they're available, readily available, and give you, you put in your zip code and it tells you how many miles from there you need to be, and it tells you where to find them. And how many courses they supposedly still have in stock, supposedly. I guess if we keep up the numbers. Let's take, yes. I would agree with you. The problem is in my location, unless it's a university or the free clinic, we don't have any independents that have it. Ours are Walgreens and CVS's. Yeah, so all we have is Walgreens and CVS that have the drug. Yeah, and part of that's because they're also open longer hours. Yes.
One of the things I ran into was Prime Therapeutics sent me a contract, but it was $1 dispense fee. And Emeritus sent me a contract and it was $2 dispense fee. Now, I don't know if it's changed, but I'm not going to waste my time.
I understand.
To order that and counsel a patient for either one of those.
Did you hear what he said? He said that Humana and another company, Prime Therapeutics, had offered him a contract to dispense these drugs, but they're only going to pay him a dispensing fee of $1 or $2. Yep. But that's, you got to remember, they're in the money, to save their money, not your money. And they're not really there to help your patient either. They want you to supplement their helping their patients. They're the ones that should be encouraging you to get involved and do it, should incentivize you to help make a difference for their patients.
Especially if 89%, what was the
89% reduction.
Yeah.
But Prime Therapeutics and Humana, unless they're also covering the hospitalization course, again, and some of those things are carved out, they're not going to save any money. Depends on who's paying the bill for the hospitalization, but they're penny wise and pound foolish. Yep. Well, let's